Washington's decision to arm Syria's Sunni Muslim rebels has plunged America into the great Sunni-Shia conflict of the Islamic Middle East, entering a struggle that now dwarfs the Arab revolutions which overthrew dictatorships across the region. For the first time, all of America's friends in the region are Sunni Muslims and all of its enemies are Shiites. Breaking all President Barack Obama's rules of disengagement, the U.S. is now fully engaged on the side of armed groups which include the most extreme Sunni Islamist movements in the Middle East. The Independent on Sunday has learned that a military decision has been taken in Iran even before last week's presidential election to send a first contingent of 4,000 Iranian Revolutionary Guards to Syria to support President Bashar al-Assad's forces against the largely Sunni rebellion that has cost almost 100,000 lives in just over 2 years. Iran is now fully committed to preserving Assad's regime, according to pro-Iranian sources which have been deeply involved in the Islamic Republic's security, even to the extent of proposing to open up a new Syrian front on the Golan Heights against Israel. In years to come, historians will ask how America, after its defeat in Iraq and its humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan scheduled for 2014, could have so blithely aligned itself with one side in a titanic Islamic struggle stretching back to the 7th century death of the Prophet Muhammad. The profound effects of this great schism, between Sunnis who believe that the father of Muhammad's wife was the new caliph of the Muslim world and Shias who regard his son-in-law Ali as his rightful successor, a 7th century battle swamped in blood around the present-day Iraqi cities of Najaf and Karbala continue across the region to this day. A 17th century Archbishop of Canterbury, George Abbot, compared this Muslim conflict to that between Papists and Protestants. America's alliance now includes the wealthiest states of the Arab Gulf, the vast Sunni territories between Egypt and Morocco, as well as Turkey and the fragile British-created monarchy in Jordan. King Abdullah of Jordan flooded, like so many neighboring nations, by hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees may also now find himself at the fulcrum of the Syrian battle. Up to 3,000 American advisors are now believed to be in Jordan, and the creation of a southern Syria no-fly zone opposed by Syrian-controlled anti-aircraft batteries will turn a crisis into a hot war. So much for America's friends. Its enemies include the Lebanese Hezbollah, the Alawite Shiite regime in Damascus and, of course, Iran. And Iraq, a largely Shiite nation which America liberated from Saddam Hussein's Sunni minority in the hope of balancing the Shiite power of Iran, has against all U.S. predictions itself now largely fallen under Tehran's influence and power. Iraqi Shiites as well as Hezbollah members, have both fought alongside Assad's forces. Washington's excuse for its new Middle East adventure that it must arm Assad's enemies because the Damascus regime has used sarin gas against them convinces no one in the Middle East. Final proof of the use of gas by either side in Syria remains almost as nebulous as President George W. Bush's claim that Saddam's Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. For the real reason why America has thrown its military power behind Syria's Sunni rebels is because those same rebels are now losing their war against Assad. The Damascus regime's victory this month in the central Syrian town of Qusayr, at the cost of Hezbollah lives as well as those of government forces, has thrown the Syrian revolution into turmoil, threatening to humiliate American and EU demands for Assad to abandon power. Arab dictators are supposed to be deposed unless they are the friendly kings or emirs of the Gulf not to be sustained. Yet Russia has given its total support to Assad, 3 times vetoing UN Security Council resolutions that might have allowed the West to intervene directly in the civil war. In the Middle East, there is cynical disbelief at the American contention that it can distribute arms almost certainly including anti-aircraft missiles only to secular Sunni rebel forces in Syria represented by the so-called Free Syria Army. The more powerful al-Nusra Front, allied to al-Qaeda, dominates the battlefield on the rebel side and has been blamed for atrocities including the execution of Syrian government prisoners of war and the murder of a 14-year-old boy for blasphemy. They will be able to take new American weapons from their Free Syria Army comrades with little effort. From now on, therefore, every suicide bombing in Damascus, every war crime committed by the rebels, will be regarded in the region as Washington's responsibility. The very Sunni Wahhabi Islamists who killed thousands of Americans on September 11, 2011, who are America's greatest enemies as well as Russia's, are going to be proxy allies of the Obama administration. This terrible irony can only be exacerbated by Russian President Vladimir Putin's adamant refusal to tolerate any form of Sunni extremism. His experience in Chechnya, his anti-Muslim rhetoric, he has made obscene remarks about Muslim extremists in a press conference in Russian, and his belief that Russia's old ally in Syria is facing the same threat as Moscow fought in Chechnya, plays a far greater part in his policy towards Bashar al-Assad than the continued existence of Russia's naval port at the Syrian Mediterranean city of Tartus. For the Russians, of course, the Middle East is not in the east at all, but to the south of Moscow, and statistics are all important. The Chechen capital of Grozny is scarcely 500 miles from the Syrian frontier. 15% of Russians are Muslim. 6 of the Soviet Union's communist republics had a Muslim majority, 90% of whom were Sunni. And Sunnis around the world make up perhaps 85% of all Muslims. For a Russia intent on repositioning itself across a landmass that includes most of the former Soviet Union, Sunni Islamists of the kind now fighting the Assad regime are its principal antagonists. Iranian sources say they liaise constantly with Moscow, and that while Hezbollah's overall withdrawal from Syria is likely to be completed soon with the maintenance of the militia's intelligence teams inside Syria, Iran's support for Damascus will grow rather than wither. They point out that the Taliban recently sent a formal delegation for talks in Tehran and that America will need Iran's help in withdrawing from Afghanistan. The US, the Iranians say, will not be able to take its armor and equipment out of the country during its continuing war against the Taliban without Iran's active assistance. One of the sources claimed, not without some mirth, that the French were forced to leave 50 tanks behind when they left because they did not have Tehran's help. It is a sign of the changing historical template in the Middle East that within the framework of old Cold War rivalries between Washington and Moscow, Israel's security has taken second place to the conflict in Syria. Indeed, Israel's policies in the region have been knocked askew by the Arab revolutions, leaving its prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, hopelessly adrift amid the historic changes. Only once over the past 2 years has Israel fully condemned atrocities committed by the Assad regime, and while it has given medical help to wounded rebels on the Israeli-Syrian border, it fears an Islamist caliphate in Damascus far more than a continuation of Assad's rule. One former Israel intelligence commander recently described Assad as Israel's man in Damascus. Only days before President Mubarak was overthrown, both Netanyahu and King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia called Washington to ask Obama to save the Egyptian dictator. In vain. If the Arab world has itself been overwhelmed by the 2 years of revolutions, none will have suffered from the Syrian war in the long term more than the Palestinians. The land they wish to call their future state has been so populated with Jewish Israeli colonists that it can no longer be either secure or viable. Peace envoy Tony Blair's attempts to create such a state have been laughable. A future Palestine would be a Sunni nation. But today, Washington scarcely mentions the Palestinians. Another of the region's supreme ironies is that Hamas, supposedly the super-terrorists of Gaza, have abandoned Damascus and now support the Gulf Arabs' desire to crush Assad. Syrian government forces claim that Hamas has even trained Syrian rebels in the manufacture and use of homemade rockets. In Arab eyes, Israel's 2006 war against the Shia Hezbollah was an attempt to strike at the heart of Iran. The West's support for Syrian rebels is a strategic attempt to crush Iran. But Iran is going to take the offensive. Even for the Middle East, these are high stakes. Against this fearful background, the Palestinian tragedy continues.